Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. The majority of you voted for a book 3, so here we are. This week we are starting Manitou Blood by Graham Masterton. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Chapter 1, Bloodwork. It was only a few minutes after 11 in the morning, but already the sun was beating on the sidewalks as hard as a blacksmith's hammer. As he crossed Herald Square in his flappy brown linen suit and his green Matrix-style sunglasses, Dr. Winter saw a small crowd gathered outside Macy's. At first, he thought they must be looking at a new window display, but then he realized that a mime artist was performing in front of the store. Frank Witter had an irrational aversion to mimes, or jugglers, or clowns, or any other kind of street performers. Behind their painted-on grins, he had always suspected that they were sly and spiteful and out to cause mischief. But this mime caught his attention. She was a girl, to begin with, a very thin, small-boned girl, in a one-piece suit made of tight, silver fabric. Her short-cropped hair was stiff with silver paint, and her face was painted silver, too. Frank stopped for a moment and watched her. Her suit was so tight that she could almost have been naked. Underneath her Tin Man makeup, she had a thin, sculpted face that was almost beautiful in a starved, waif-like way, and pale blue staring eyes. But it wasn't only her appearance that held him there, it was her extraordinary performance. She swayed from side to side, giving the impression that she was defying gravity. Then she began to mime that she was climbing, and somehow she made it appear as if she was actually making her way up a ladder. At the top of the ladder she teetered and nearly lost her balance. 2 small children who were watching her stepped instinctively back, as if she was really going to fall on them from 20 feet up. Frank pressed his hand to the back of his head because the sun was beating on his neck. It was well over 93 degrees, with 85% humidity. Nobody could walk around the city without gum sticking to the soles of their shoes, and the crowd around him was mostly dressed in T-shirts and shorts and sandals, and were furiously fanning themselves with newspapers and tour guides. It had been sweltering like this for over a week now, since the 2nd day of August, and the weathermen were predicting the longest heat wave in New York City since the summer of 1926. Up on top of her imaginary ladder, however, the girl began to clutch herself and shiver as if she were freezing. She stood on the sidewalk quaking, and even though the sun was beating on the back of his neck, Frank could almost feel a chill, too, as if somebody had opened up a refrigerator door right behind him. He turned to the man standing next to him and said, "Wow, she's something, isn't she?" The man looked Italian, or maybe Greek. He was bearded, with a flattened nose like an osprey's beak, and bulging brown eyes, and he was wearing a strange dangling earring, like a miniature dream catcher, all feathers and beads and fishhooks. He raised his eyebrows and smiled, but didn't reply. Frank wasn't sure if the man had understood him. "I mean, the way she's shivering like that, she's actually making me feel cold." "Well," said the man, still smiling, "she is one of the pale ones, that's why." "The pale ones?" said Frank. He shook his head to show that he didn't understand. "I would gladly explain it to you, sir, but you would probably not believe me." "Well, you could try me. I'm a doctor, and you know us doctors, we're ready to believe anything." The girl began to climb down her imaginary ladder until she reached the ground. Then she sat on her red and yellow rug on the sidewalk and twisted her arms and legs together so that she tied herself into a human knot. If he hadn't seen it for himself, Frank would have said that it was anatomically impossible. Her face was looking at him from between her legs, emotionless, remote, but strangely threatening, as if she were warning him to keep his distance. She rolled around the sidewalk in a ball, and then, in one fluid movement, she disentangled her arms and legs and stood up, her arms spread wide. The small crowd applauded, and 2 Con Ed workers gave her a piercing whistle. Gradually dropping nickels and dimes into her silver-painted basket, the crowd dispersed, but the girl stayed where she was, leaning against Macy's window with both hands, breathing deeply, staring at herself. The Greek-looking man stayed, too. Frank took off his sunglasses. He could see himself reflected in the store window behind her, a tall, broad-shouldered man with brushed-back hedgehog hair that was graying at the sides. "That was quite some performance," he told her. "I'm a doctor, and believe me, I've never seen anybody who can tie themselves up quite like that." The girl lifted herself away from the window and turned around. She looked Frank up and down as if she already knew who he was, but she didn't speak. Frank wondered if she might be such a good mime because she was genuinely mute. He glanced again at the Greek-looking man, but the Greek-looking man didn't seem to be interested in contributing anything to the conversation either. "Well, great show," Frank told her, uncomfortably. "I have to be getting on." He took out a $1 bill, and he was leaning forward to drop it in her basket when the girl suddenly raised her hand to her throat and made a gagging noise. She took a stiff-legged step toward him, and then another. At first, he assumed that she was acting, but her eyes were wide, and she kept opening and closing her mouth as if she couldn't breathe. Without warning, she vomited blood, a bright red, clattering cascade that splattered the sidewalk in front of her and splashed all over Frank's shoes. She tilted back and then sank to her knees. Frank knelt down beside her and put his arm around her. "What's wrong? Are you sick with something? Have you been to see your doctor?" The girl shook her head. She looked terrified. Frank shouted, "Call 911!" But there was no reply. "I said, call," he began, but when he turned around, the Greek-looking man was hurrying away like the White Rabbit. "Listen," he told the girl, reaching into his shirt pocket for his cell phone. "I'm going to call for an ambulance. Get you into the emergency room right now." The girl nodded. She started to say something, but then she vomited even more blood, so that Frank's sleeve was soaked. A few passers-by had stopped to watch them, but most people were staying well away, even crossing over the street. Frank didn't entirely blame them. He and the girl were plastered in so much blood that it looked as if they had been fighting each other with box cutters. All he could do was kneel down beside her and hold her close against his chest while she sicked up more and more blood. She was shaking wildly, and now she felt genuinely cold. It seemed to take an hour for the ambulance to arrive, although it was probably less than 10 minutes. The sun beat down on the blood that was splattered on the sidewalk so that it steamed. Frank heard sirens and banging doors and the rattle of a gurney, and then he was being helped up onto his feet. A woman paramedic was staring very closely into his face. "Were you injured, sir? You want to show me where you're injured?" Dr. Gathering said, "The good news, Frank, is that she's HIV negative." Frank was standing by the window of his 27th floor office at the Sisters of Jerusalem, looking down at West 36th Street below. The traffic was sparkling in the sunshine, and the crowds far below him were dressed in bright reds and yellows and greens, like a scattered assortment of jelly beans. "What's the bad news?" George, gathering, opened the plastic folder that he was carrying and took out 3 sheets of test results. I'd call it bewildering rather than bad. She must have vomited more than 2 liters of blood, not counting the blood she brought up before we got her into the emergency. By rights, she should be dead. I thought it might have been a perforated ulcer. Well, that was my first guess too, but we haven't found any serious erosion of the stomach lining, although I think it's worth doing another x-ray. We haven't found any varices in the esophagus either. Her liver's healthy, and she has no portal hypertension. So where was all that blood coming from? We're not sure yet, but you know how ulcers can hide themselves out of plain sight. Still, this is very unusual, wouldn't you say? Usually, if a patient's bringing up that much blood, well, it's almost impossible to stop it. Like I say, I want to try another x-ray, but she has some other unusual symptoms too. Oh yeah? Like what? Her digestive chemistry is seriously out of whack for a young woman of her age. Her stomach lining is secreting less intrinsic factor than an 80-year-old's, which means, of course, that she isn't absorbing vitamin B12. So she's anemic? Yes, she is. Not only that, or maybe because of that, she's hypersensitive to sunlight. We cleaned all that silver paint off her, but when we tried to put her in a bed by the window, she literally screamed. We had to move her into a room of her own with all the blinds pulled down. What's her history? She says that her name is Susan Fireman. She's 23 years old, and she's a third-year fashion student at the Beekman College of Art and Design. She shares a loft on East 26th Street with 2 other girls and one of their boyfriends. The mime thing is just a hobby, apparently. Her medical records are still held by her family doctor in New Rochelle. That's where her parents live. We're trying to contact him now. Apart from the usual childhood diseases, though, she says that the only problems she's ever had are painful periods and an allergy to steamers. Have you contacted her parents? Not yet. She specifically requested us not to. She says that her dad has a serious heart condition and she doesn't want to worry them. I see. Has she been out of the country lately? George sorted through his notes. The last vacation she took was to Mexico last October, 11 days in Cancun. Have any of her friends or acquaintances shown any signs of sickness? Not so far as she's aware, but there's one other symptom. She's been having a persistent nightmare. A nightmare? Nightmares don't make you vomit blood. No, of course not. But for some reason, she seemed to think it was important. She's been having it night after night for more than a month, always the same one. Go on. She thinks that she's deep inside a ship, somewhere in the middle of the ocean, but she's shut up inside a box, and it's totally dark, and she can't get out. That's it? George closed his folder. That's it. But she says that it's so realistic that she doesn't like to go to sleep anymore. Yes, said Frank. He thought about the time that his father had taken him to the circus when he was 5, and a clown had come right up to him and screamed in his face. I used to have a nightmare like that. Frank had given his assistant Marjorie the day off today so that she could visit her elderly mother in Paramus. He put on his Armani half glasses to check his email, most of which was spam from pharmaceutical companies. Then he sorted quickly through his letters, tossing aside the circulars and tearing open the envelopes that looked as if they might contain checks. He called pediatrics to check when he was due for his afternoon clinic, 3:45 on the 16th floor. Then he bought himself a large double-strength espresso from the vending machine and went down to the 11th floor to visit Susan Fireman. I've been praying on my knees for this heat to let up, said Sister Domenica in the elevator. "I had to use the subway this morning, and I do believe that the Lord was giving me a preview of the other place in case I was ever tempted to misbehave." Sister Domenica must have weighed over 225 pounds, and her face was pale and knobbly like an Idaho potato. She might have been tempted to misbehave, thought Frank, as the elevator doors opened yet again and more people crowded in, but where was she going to find somebody to misbehave with? He walked along the shiny corridor to room 1566. The door was ajar, but it looked as if Susan Fireman were sleeping, so he stepped quietly inside without knocking. The blinds were all drawn down over the windows, but a faint, moth-shaped twist of sunlight quivered on the wall, illuminating a picture of Jesus standing by the Sea of Galilee. The air conditioning had been turned to Nome, Alaska, and Frank couldn't stop himself from shivering, just like Susan Fireman had shivered at the top of her imaginary ladder. Frank went up to her bedside and looked down at her. She was breathing steadily, with an oxygen tube in her nostrils. Her face was so white that her skin was almost translucent, like a death mask molded out of candle wax, but she seemed to be peaceful. The nurses had combed most of the silver paint out of her short, dark brown hair, but it was still dry and tangled and out of condition. He balanced his cup of coffee on the bright red crash cart next to her bed and checked her monitor. Her blood pressure was low, and her pulse was a little too quick, but there was no arrhythmia. He was tapping the touch-sensitive screen to check on her CO2 and her FiO2 when he became aware that her eyes were open and that she was watching him. "Oh, you're awake," he smiled. "How are you feeling?" "Sick," she whispered. "You can talk, then?" She nodded. "Yes, but only when I have to." "Is there a reason for that?" "Not really, but if you stay silent, you can never tell lies, can you? And nobody can ever misquote you." He finished checking her vitals. "I don't think I'd last very long in my line of work if I had to mime everything." "Oh, you'd be surprised," she said. She circled her head around and around with her eyes crossed. "Dizzy spells," she explained. "Okay," Frank conceded. "I guess it's just as well that you're so good. There's no way I would have stopped to watch you otherwise." "You don't like mimes?" All that smelling pretend daisies and leaning up against pretend walls, that doesn't do anything for me, I'm afraid." "I see. You're one of those people who refuse to believe that things exist unless you can actually see them." "When it comes to walls, yes." "How about ladders?" "Okay, for a split second, yes, you did make me believe that you were climbing a ladder." She gave him a faint, sloping smile. "I could have climbed higher, but I lost my nerve." "Sure," he said. He leaned over her and shone his flashlight into her eyes, one after the other. "You took care of me," she told him. "Hold still. Of course I took care of you. It's my job. You were lucky that the finest gastroenterologist in the entire Western Hemisphere happened to be watching you when you started to bring up all that blood." "Do you have any idea what's wrong with me?" she asked him. "Not yet. You have very low blood pressure, which is causing us some serious concern. Your CBC shows that you also have pernicious anemia, which is probably caused by an inability to absorb sufficient quantities of vitamin B12. But neither of those conditions would directly cause you to hemorrhage, and so far we haven't been able to detect any lesions in your digestive tract or any vesicles in your esophagus." "I'm not sure I know what any of that means." "It means simply that we haven't yet discovered what's wrong with you." She didn't answer him directly, but turned her face away so that she was staring at the picture of Jesus. He looks sad, don't you think? Have you been feeling at all sick lately? Frank asked her. No, not exactly. I have been feeling different. Are you on any medication? Anti-anxiety agents? Antidepressants? How about diuretics? I take ginger and yarrow for menstrual cramps. Okay, how about alcohol? How much do you drink on an average? A glass of red wine sometimes, but not very often. I get drunk very easily, and I don't like losing control. Street drugs? Never. Well, once, but that was over a year ago. Tell me about your diet. Are you a vegetarian? She nodded, although she still kept her face turned away. Sometimes strict vegetarians suffer from vitamin B12 deficiency, Frank told her. It's pretty easily sorted, though, with tablets or injections. He scribbled a few notes, and then he said, Dr. Gathering tells me you're very sensitive to sunlight. How long have you suffered from that? I don't know, 3 or 4 days, maybe longer. I can't really remember. Is it just your eyes, or is your skin sensitive too? Do you get a rash or anything like that? Susan Fireman shook her head. I can't go without my makeup, even if the sun's not shining. What happens if you don't wear makeup? It hurts. It feels like I'm standing an inch too close to a furnace. Frank made a note to talk to Dr. Xavier, the skin specialist. Then he said, You've been having recurrent nightmares too, I understand? Susan Fireman pulled a dismissive face, as if she didn't want to talk about it. A recurrent nightmare can sometimes be a symptom of an underlying medical problem. It's your body sending a warning to your brain that something might be seriously wrong. I don't know. This feels more like a memory than a nightmare. You keep dreaming that you're on board a ship, is that it? And you're shut up inside a box in the dark? Not just shut up. The lid's screwed down tight, and there are more boxes stacked on top of my box, so that I couldn't possibly get out, even if I wasn't. I see. So how do you know you're on board a ship? Because I can feel it moving. It pitches up and down, and then it rolls, and I can hear timbers creaking and the sound of the ocean. Sometimes I hear somebody shouting in a very sing-song way, and that frightens me more than anything else. Do you know who it is? Susan Fireman turned back and looked at him. It's a boy, by the sound of it. He shouts out something like, Total Nostru, over and over again. There's a whole lot more, but when I wake up, I can never remember it. Paddle Nostru? Do you have any idea what language that is? None, but it frightens me because the boy sounds so frightened. Frank said, We're going to have to do some more tests, some allergy tests and some eye tests and at least one more x-ray to see if we can find an ulcer. I think we need to contact your parents, don't you, and let them know what's going on? My dad's real sick. I don't want him upset. Well, maybe we could talk to your mother first and let her decide how to tell him. Susan Fireman thought for a moment, and then she said, No, leave it for now, please. I'll tell her myself. Is there anyone else you want us to talk to? How about the people you room with? No, don't tell them. Don't you think they're going to be worried when you don't come home? Please. Frank tucked his notebook back in his pocket. Okay, you're the boss. I'll come back later and see how you're getting along. He was walking back through his office door when his beeper went off. It was Dr. Gathering, and it said urgent. He pressed his phone button and said, George, what's happening? Willie's sent me up the final results of Susan Fireman's blood work. She's anemic, no question about it, but there's something else, too. Willie says that she has some enzyme in her bloodstream that he can't identify. He might have to send it off to Rochester. Well, I've just been down to talk to her, and there's definitely something unique about her. That's not all, Frank. Willie also tested a sample of the blood that she vomited. Yes? It's not hers. In fact, it's two different blood types altogether. She's type AB, but the blood that she vomited was a mixture of type A and type O. What? I'm afraid so, Frank. That blood didn't get into her stomach from internal bleeding. She drank it. Chapter 2. Bloodthirst. While Frank and George sat on the low-slung leather couch and watched him, Dr. Pellman skimmed through the results of the blood tests, tapping his ballpoint pen furiously against his teeth. Eventually, he threw himself back in his chair and said, "Crap. We thought you ought to see it ASAP," said George. "Well, you're damn right about that. We need to call the police, and we need to call them now." He leaned across his desk and flipped his intercom switch. "Janice?" "Yes, sir." "Get me Captain Mesnick at Midtown South, and make it snappy." He read the blood tests again, more slowly. "We're sure about this? There's no room for any mistake?" He was a small man with a high white pompadour and compressed hobbit-like features. His staff called him the Death Troll, but they respected him. He was fierce and quick-tempered and a formidable stickler for detail. "No mistakes, sir," George told him. Willie repeated his tests twice just to make sure. It's human blood, and there's no question that it isn't hers, unless she stole it from a blood bank or she's been keeping it refrigerated. There have to be at least 2 people out there who have lost a serious amount of blood, almost certainly a fatal amount. The intercom buzzed. "Lieutenant Roberts on the phone, sir. Captain Mesnick is away in Philadelphia at a law enforcement convention." "Okay, that's okay." Dr. Pellman picked up his phone. "Lieutenant Roberts, this is Harold Pellman, Senior VP and Medical Director at the Sisters of Jerusalem. I won't beat around the bush. We have a young woman here who appears to have been drinking blood." Frank could only guess what Lieutenant Roberts' reaction was on the other end of the phone, but Dr. Pellman had to repeat himself twice. "Drinking blood, Lieutenant. Human blood, and other people's blood, not her own. And unless they've been given an emergency transfusion, whoever she drank it from is probably dead." He spelled out Susan Fireman's address and personal details, and then he hung up the phone. "That's it, gentlemen. There's nothing else we can do." Frank stayed in his seat. "With all due respect, sir, I think I should try to talk to Ms. Fireman before the police get here. We really need to find out why she ingested all that blood and who she got it from." "Bad idea," said Dr. Pellman. "You're not a detective, Frank, and I don't want anybody on this hospital's medical staff laying themselves open to accusations of compromising a police investigation. You remember what happened with the Kozlowski kid. Nightmare." "Yes, sir," said Frank. "But Ms. Fireman is still our patient, isn't she? No matter what she's done, we're morally bound to pursue our diagnostic procedure until we find out what's wrong with her." "Frank, for God's sake, we know what's wrong with her. She's been binging on other people's circulatory systems, and it's almost a certainty that she's killed them in the process." "I realize that, sir, but for all we know, drinking human blood may be a key symptom of her condition. If we don't investigate it, well, I personally think that we'd be failing in our duty as physicians." George said very quietly, "I'm afraid I have to agree with that. Supposing her condition can be transmitted, if one of our staff catches it or one of our other patients goes down with it, the legal consequences don't bear thinking about." "So that's it," said Dr. Pellman. "We're damned if we do and doubly damned if we don't." Frank said, "All I need to do is ask her some very straightforward questions, like, whose blood did you drink? Where did you get it from? And how and why did you drink it?" "And what do you think the cops will ask her?" "Exactly the same things." "But once the police get here, she's far less likely to respond to any questions about her condition in case she incriminates herself. And if she gets herself a lawyer, forget it. We won't have a hope in hell of finding out what's wrong with her. She has a highly unusual combination of physical symptoms, her anemia, her sensitivity to light, and she obviously has severe psychological problems too." Dr. Pellman tossed down his pen. "Okay, but don't ask her anything other than medical questions, and if she refuses to answer, don't push her, and don't instigate any new diagnostic procedures until you've cleared them with me." They were just about to leave his office when Frank's beeper buzzed again. "Okay if I use your phone, sir?" he asked Dr. Pellman. Dr. Pellman gave him a wave of his hand, and Frank picked it up. "Dean Garrett here, Frank, in the emergency room. We've just had a young man brought in here, vomiting blood. His symptoms are very similar to that girl you brought in this morning." "I'll be right down." Frank cradled the phone, and then he looked at Dr. Pellman with a serious expression. "Sounds like we've got ourselves another one." Frank and George went down together to the ER. As they arrived, 7 victims of a gang fight were being brought through the doors by paramedics, all shouting and swearing and covered in blood. Dr. Garrett grabbed one of the gang members by the lapels of his sleeveless leather vest. "What's your name, Bobo?" he demanded. Dean Garrett was thin and unshaven, and he had a drooping mustache like Wyatt Earp, but he was so wired and wild-eyed that the boy couldn't help stumbling to attention. "Julius," the boy blurted out, "what's it to you?" He had one eye closed by a big purple bruise and a deep diagonal cut across his lips. "What gang do you belong to, Julius?" "The Blue Moros." "The Blue Morons? That's appropriate. And those other Bobos? Which gang do they belong to?" "The X-Skulls." "Okay, Julius. My name is Dr. Dean, and I belong to the Screaming Medics, and this emergency room is my turf from which you will not escape alive if you so much as break wind out of tune. Look at you. You think this is tough, what you Galapos have done to each other? Superficial scratches, that's all. I've been trained to take a man's entire insides out without even him knowing that I've done it, take him out in handfuls and heap them on the nightstand next to his bed. And if you don't behave yourself, I promise I will do it to you." Julius opened his bruised and bloodied lips but said nothing, and when Dean Garrett let go of his vest, he sullenly beckoned the members of his own gang over to the far end of the emergency room, well away from their rivals. "Kids," said Dean. "That's all they are, kids, and you have to treat them like kids." George said, "I don't know how you cope with it, Dean. Most of my patients are dear old ladies with purple hair, and they run me ragged." "It's simple," said Dean. "You have to be 10 times more scary than they are. That's all." "You are, believe me," Frank told him. "What's a Galapo?" Roughly translated, a dickhead. Dean led them down to the last triage cubicle, farthest away from the doors. He dragged back the curtain, and there lay a skinny young man of about 19 or 20, shaking and shivering, his t-shirt thick with glistening blood. The young man's hair was sticking up, and his eyes were flickering wildly from side to side. A big black emergency nurse was adjusting his saline drip, while a spotty blonde one was standing beside him with a stainless steel basin. Almost as soon as they came into the cubicle, the young man sat up with a spastic jerk and vomited blood into the basin. He retched, with strings of blood swinging from his chin, and then he dropped back onto the bed, still shivering. The nurse was about to take the basin away, but Frank said, "Don't throw that away. Take that to Dr. Lohman for analysis. We need a blood sample out of his veins, but we also need a sample of the blood that he's just vomited." "You think he might have been poisoned?" asked Dean. "It's possible, but if he's anything like the young lady we're looking after upstairs, we need to check what type it is. The blood that she was vomiting wasn't her own." "You mean, my God." "Frankly, Dean, I don't know what I mean." Frank approached the bed and leaned over it. The young man's eyes were wide open, but his pupils were still darting around, and he was muttering and twitching, and occasionally he arched his back as if he were being electrocuted. "Listen to me, son," said Frank loudly. "Listen to me. Do you know where you are?" The young man clutched at the sheets, obviously making an effort to control himself. I'm Listen to me. Try to concentrate. My name is Dr. Winter, and you've been admitted to the Sisters of Jerusalem Hospital. Can you tell me your name?" "Where was he picked up?" asked Frank. "Port Authority. He was standing in line for a bus ticket when he collapsed." "Any ID?" "Nothing. The paramedics said they couldn't find a wallet. Either he didn't have one, which seems unlikely since he was waiting to buy a bus ticket, or else somebody lifted it while he was lying on the ground, puking his guts up." "It's a happy world," said Frank. "Okay," said Dean. "We'll run the usual tests and let you know the results pronto, but I just thought you ought to see him." "Sure, thanks." They heard shouting and whooping and clattering. The blue Moros had started taunting the ex-skulls from opposite ends of the emergency room, and one of the ex-skulls had picked up a chair and was brandishing it in the air as if he intended to throw it. Dean said, "Excuse me for a moment. I have some heads to crack." George checked his watch. "I have to go too, Frank. Lunch with my tax lawyer." "Okay," said Frank. "Let's talk later." Frank stayed beside the young man's bed for a little while longer. His face was even whiter than Susan Fireman's, and he seemed to be much more distressed. At least Susan Fireman had been reasonably coherent. It was difficult to tell if this young man even knew where he was or what had happened to him. "I can't find, he gagged. "You can't find what?" Frank asked him. "Your wallet? Is it your wallet you're worried about?" "I can't find where I have to go." "You were standing in line for a bus ticket. Do you know where you were intending to travel?" "Got to, Frank took hold of his hand. "Listen, the best thing you can do is get some rest. We're running some lab tests, and once we're done with that, we'll have a clearer picture of what's wrong with you." "Total nostru." "What did you say?" Frank looked up at the big black nurse, but all she could do was shrug. "Sounded like something to do with his nose," she said. "Maybe he's having difficulty breathing." "Total nostru," the man repeated. His heart rate was jiggling excitedly up and down, while his blood pressure had started to sink like the Titanic. He sputtered, and then he coughed up more blood and snatched at Frank's sleeve. Total nostru. Frank turned to the nurse and said, epinephrine, and quick. Then he turned back to the young man. Listen, can you hear me? Try not to get too stressed. Your whole system's had a serious shock, and you really need to stay calm. Total nostru, carele este in its aero, the young man panted. Don't try to talk, Frank told him. Breathe deeply and evenly. That's right. And relax. The young man stared at Frank wide-eyed. Bubbles of blood were frothing at the corners of his mouth, and his chest was heaving up and down as if he had been running a marathon. Sfintiska se nemle tua, via imparatia tafaka se viota. Please, don't try to talk, Frank repeated. You need to keep as quiet and as steady as you can. The nurse came back with the bottle of epinephrine and a hypodermic. Frank lifted up the young man's blood-crusted arm, wiped it with an antiseptic tissue, found a vein, and injected it. Panea nostra, sia de torta dene o estasi. Frank waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. At first he thought he might have made a mistake, and that the young man wasn't suffering from an anaphylactic seizure after all. But gradually the young man's heart began to beat more steadily, and his blood pressure began to climb, and he stopped panting for air. All the same, his lips kept moving, as if he had to finish his recitation, no matter what. Sinu ne dulce prenua en espita, sine scapa de celuria. After a while, though, he stopped talking, and his eyes closed. Frank peeled back his right eyelid with his thumb, and although his pupil was still darting wildly from side to side, he was clearly unconscious. Frank said to the nurse, I need you to keep a real close watch on him, okay? It's possible that he may suffer another allergic episode when this wears off. Dean came back, looking harassed. Sorry to leave you like that, Frank. How's he doing? Anaphylaxis. He had a severe allergic reaction to something he's ingested or something he's touched. He's okay now? I gave him 2 milligrams of epinephrine. Dean bent over the young man, frowning. These symptoms, I don't know. They don't seem related to each other in any logical way at all. There's something weird going on here. You think? That isn't the half of it. He was talking in some foreign language. Really? Which one? Nothing that I've ever heard before. Middle European, maybe, but it wasn't Russian. I can recognize Russian, and it didn't have enough Z's in it to be Polish. Well, people say some pretty wacky things when they're sick. Not as wacky as this. What do you mean? The first few words he came out with, they were exactly the same words that the girl upstairs has been hearing in her nightmares. You're shitting me. No, she says she has a reoccurring nightmare in which she's trapped inside a box on a ship. She can't get out, but she can hear this boy's voice saying "Tatel Nostru" over and over, like he's really frightened. Tatel Nostru? Something like that. That's about as close as I can pronounce it. And this guy said Tatel Nostru too? Maybe they know each other. It might explain why they're both suffering from the same condition, something they've eaten, maybe. I don't know, said Frank, looking down at the young man in his blood-soaked T-shirt. For some reason, I have a very bad feeling about this. He went to the wash basin to wash his hands. Before he squirted out the medical cleanser, though, he lifted his fingers to his nose and sniffed them, and then sniffed them again. What's wrong? Asked Dean. Frank held out his fingertips so that Dean could smell them too. That so much reminds me of something, said Dean. Don't tell me. And if you don't know what this is, you haven't been on vacation for a very long while. It smells like pina colada. It's sunblock. When Frank went back to room 1566, Susan Fireman seemed to be sleeping, but when he carried a chair over to her bedside, she opened her eyes. "Dr. Winter," she said dreamily, "I thought you might be back." "So you have a good idea what I'm going to ask you?" She nodded. "Okay then, subject to further tests, it appears that you're not suffering from any internal bleeding. No ulcers, no varices. The blood that you were vomiting came from somebody else. In fact, it came from two somebody else's." He waited for a moment, and then, when she didn't answer, he said, "Do you think you can maybe explain that?" "I don't know why," she whispered. "You don't know why what?" "I don't know why I did it. It was like I wasn't even me." Frank said, "You drank all of that blood, didn't you? It wasn't yours at all." "I don't know why. I can't understand it." "Whose blood was it, Susan? What did you do to them?" "It was so confusing. I could see myself doing it, but it was like I was watching somebody else." "Whose blood was it, Susan?" She closed her eyes and didn't answer. Frank waited for a long moment, and then he said, "Susan, I need to know who that blood came from." "Why?" she said, without opening her eyes. "What difference does it make?" "It makes a difference because anybody who lost that much blood is most likely dead." "That's what those people are for, isn't it?" "I don't understand." "That's what those people are born for, to give us their blood." Frank said, "Open your eyes." "Why?" "I want you to look at me when you're talking to me, or are you scared to?" "I'm not scared of anything." "I think you are. I think you're scared of yourself. I think you're scared of what you did." "I drank blood, all right? I needed to." "Why did you need to?" She suddenly opened her eyes and exploded in fury. I was burning all over. I was on fire, and that was the only way to stop it." "So you had to drink blood to stop the burning?" "You don't understand. My whole body was on fire. I would have died without it." "So whose blood was it, Susan?" "Don't you get it? I would have died." She stared at him fiercely, but her ferocity didn't last for very long. He sat back and said nothing, and she began to relax. After a few moments, she closed her eyes again and lay on her pillow utterly still, as if she were sleeping or dead. Frank waited. He was tempted to ask her again whose blood it was, but he had the feeling that she was going to tell him if he gave her enough time. Eventually, she spoke in a very flat, detached voice. "Look at me," she said. "I'm opening my bedroom door." She paused for a moment, licking her lips as if they were dry. "Where are you now?" Frank asked her. "I'm in the corridor. The sunlight's falling across the corridor this way," indicating a diagonal slant. "It's falling right on the poster of Jim Morrison with gardenias in his hair. I can smell coffee, and I can hear Prissy in the kitchen singing Man on the Moon. Do you believe they put a man on the moon? Do you believe there's nothing up their sleeve?" Another pause. After a while, Frank asked, "Now what are you doing?" "I'm walking into the kitchen, and Prissy turns around to me and smiles. That's the last time she smiles at me. That's the very last time. Tatal nostru, carelli esti in seruri. What does that mean, Susan? I feel like I'm burning. There's so much sunlight. The whole kitchen is filled with sunlight and it burns. It's like I've had acid poured all over me. I'm burning all over, even my feet. Oh God, I'm going to die. I start screaming at Prissy, but Prissy doesn't understand what's wrong with me. She starts screaming too. We're both screaming, but she's screaming because she's frightened, while I'm screaming because I'm on fire. Susan's hand scrabbled sideways, touching Frank's arm. I pick up the knife. The knife! There's a big knife lying on the counter, and I pick it up. I don't hesitate. I can't hesitate. I'm on fire. I cut her like this, across her throat. There's blood spraying everywhere, all over the kitchen, all up the blinds and over the draining board. Blood, blessed blood. Prissy falls to the floor with her arms waving and her legs kicking. I kneel down beside her and I cover her wound with my mouth. I drink and I drink, but I scarcely have to swallow because her blood is pumping right down my throat, and it's warm and delicious, and it eases my burning. I drink so much that I almost drown, and Prissy's blood is running out of my nose. Susan lay quietly for another minute. Is Prissy dead? Asked Frank. Susan nodded. She looks very pale, doesn't she? But that was what she was born for. From the day she came out of her mother's womb, that was her destiny, to feed me and to stop me from burning alive. Now what do you do? I'm standing up. My bathrobe, it's so heavy. It's warm and it's soaked in blood. I need to go back to my room and change. But look, the door's opening. The door's opening and it's Michael. He stands there staring at me and he can't believe what he's looking at. What's happened? What's all this blood? Prissy, what's happened to Prissy? He doesn't understand that it's me and that I did it. He kneels down beside Prissy, and while he's holding her head, I pick up the knife again, and... She didn't finish her sentence, but mimed the way that she had cut Michael's throat, right down to the little wrist flick that she had given the knife so that the blood would fly off the tip. She clutched the side of her neck. Michael topples over sideways on top of Prissy. He's trying to push me away, but he's too busy trying to stop the blood from spurting out of his neck. Spurt! Spurt! It's everywhere, all over the floor, all over my face, all over my legs. I pull off my wet, bloody bathrobe so that I'm naked, and I'm smearing his blood around and around all over me. Frank sat and watched as she caressed her breasts and her stomach and her thighs. Blood all over me, sticky and warm, and it eases my burning so much. Blood everywhere. Blood on my legs. I can massage myself with fresh blood, and it feels wonderful. She let out a long quiver of satisfaction. Then she said, I bend over Michael, and he's staring at me. I smile at him, and I whisper, Thank you, Michael. You're an angel. I press my mouth against that gaping slit in his neck, and I swallow his blood, gulp, 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 even though I know that I'm being a glutton. Look at me. I've got blood pouring out of the sides of my mouth and then dripping off my chin. But now I've sicked some up. I can't drink any more. I'm standing up now. I'm walking along the corridor, leaving bright red footprints. I throw up some more, splatter onto the floor. Then I go into the bathroom and look at myself in the mirror. Blood woman, scarlet face, scarlet arms and legs, scarlet body. But I'm not burning anymore. I'm calm now, and my skin feels so much cooler, and I feel so What's the word? Serene. She opened her eyes and smiled at him. That's what I feel. Serene. Somebody cleared his throat. Frank turned around and saw a tall black man in a black linen suit waiting in the doorway. There was another man with him, a sallow-skinned white man in a short-sleeved shirt with jazzy red patterns on it and a blood-colored necktie. Dr. Winter, I'm Lieutenant Hayward Roberts, and this is Detective Paul Mancini. Frank pushed back his chair and stood up and almost lost his balance. Are you okay? Lieutenant Roberts asked him. No, said Dr. Winter. I think I need a very stiff drink. Well, this sounds like an exciting story, a bit bloody and gory perhaps. I hope you will join me next Saturday morning for another installment of Manitou Blood. But before I go, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Winter Sweet Ranch. They make the most incredible cowboy caramels. Not that you have much of an appetite after that story. Cowboy caramels are the real deal. All natural, handmade in small batches, crafted with pure butter, real sugar, and fresh cow's milk. No artificial flavors and no high fructose corn syrup. Just rich, velvety sweetness that melts in your mouth and keeps you coming back for more. Treat yourself to a bag of cowboy caramels today. You can order them right here in our merchandise store or go to wintersweetranch.com. Tell them Ginger sent you. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.